By agreement with the Atlantic Charter, the defeat of Germany and Italy had come first, which we talked about in the previous video. But backing up to the events in the Pacific, which was meant to be a holding action. It was meant to just stem the Japanese tide until Germany could be defeated. As events turned out, the Americans and British had far more success in the Pacific quicker than anyone anticipated. But by the time Germany surrenders, there's still a lot of work to be done, and it's seen as absolutely necessary to get the Soviet Union involved in that war effort, which helps set the stage for the coming Cold War. But let's look at events in the Pacific and how they played out through the course of World War II. Within 10 hours of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attacked the Philippines, destroying much of America's remaining air power in the Pacific. Now, we have other planes, we have other pilots, we have other equipment, but it'll have to be brought from the Atlantic coast, and it will have to be pulled from other areas to bolster the defense. And there was no way that the United States could have gotten that equipment to the Philippines in time to save the fall of the islands. 3 days after the commencement of the war, Japan invaded and captured Guam. Wake Island falls on December 23rd of 1941. Hong Kong, Singapore fall in February of 1942. The Dutch East Indies in March, Burma in April, and finally the Philippines will fall in May of 1942. So from the beginning of the war, December, through May of 1942, the U.S. forces in the Philippines will fight on against the Japanese invasion forces. They will try to interdict Japanese supply lines and Japanese offensives in other places of the Pacific, but all the while doing so with minimal support and minimal supplies. And in fact, as the handwriting was on the wall by mid-spring of 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt orders General Douglas MacArthur, the ranking American general in the Pacific, to withdraw his person and his family from the Philippines, knowing that the Philippines aren't going to hold out. They're going to fight on as long as they can, but knowing they can't hold out, that they are going to fall at some point, General MacArthur is ordered to Australia to prepare and begin planning the American counteroffensive. He was deemed too important to fall into Japanese hands. And so you see the picture on the upper left of General Jonathan Wainwright, taking command of the Philippines as MacArthur prepares to leave. And then because of a lack of what he considered reliable B-17 bombers, that the Army Air Corps wouldn't certify those bombers as guaranteed mechanically sound. Remember, everything's stretched on a shoestring. MacArthur chose not to evacuate by air, but instead have the Navy take him out in PT boats, motor torpedo boats. And so General MacArthur and his family, and you see his wife and son in the bottom picture, are pulled out of the Philippines and withdrawn to Australia. And in May of 1942, May 6, 1942, Bataan and Corregidor surrender to the Japanese. In that surrender, and you can see the fighting at Bataan and Corregidor in the bottom center picture, and then the surrender on the right side, and then on the far left side you see what became known as the Bataan Death March. These soldiers of Britain, New Zealand, Australia, the United States, Canada, that surrender to the Japanese after having fought for those 6 months, believing that by surrendering the Japanese will follow the conventions of war, that they will be treated as fair captives, they will be treated with respect and honor, the way at least America sees itself treating prisoners. Now, whether that's always been carried out to the letter is a matter of debate that we're not going to engage in here. But America sees itself as a benevolent captor. And so they surrender to the Japanese. But the Japanese mindset was surrender was for the weak. The strong either fought to the death, or in lieu of being able to fight to the death, they took their own life. That surrender was for the weak. And so as they marched these Americans into prison camps, anybody who lagged behind, anybody who became sick, quite often were just simply executed. You see the line of POWs headed toward the camp. In those sacks, they're carrying sick and wounded soldiers between them. They're subjected to the most brutal treatment you could ever think of. I've known 3 different guys throughout the course of my life. One of them quite intimately. I knew he was an instructor at a school. Was one of my instructors and had served as a pastor in a congregation I was in for a number of years. I knew him quite well. He had been beaten so often in his stomach region, even being bayoneted in his stomach region, that he had over the course of his life had something like 20 feet of intestine removed. He suffered immensely with gastrointestinal problems because of his time in Bataan. He had been on the Bataan death march and just told of the absolute horror and atrocities sometimes inflicted upon American prisoners of war out of meanness, a total disregard for life and health. And with it, in his mind at least, came an eternal hatred of Japanese. Others got over it fairly quickly and could forgive and forget. But for many, it lingered on well into the rest of their life. And so with the capture of Bataan and Corregidor, the Philippines are under Japanese control. And the Allied war effort, the whole Central and Southern Pacific, seems to be in Japanese control. And if not for the efforts that we talked about previously in the attack on Pearl Harbor, without the efforts of the submarine force keeping the Japanese offensive at bay by making Japanese commerce, transport on the seas a perilous journey at best. And in fact, you can see the first American-inflicted casualties on the Japanese Navy in the bottom left. A Japanese submarine torpedoed by an American submarine, which was an extremely rare occurrence. But it would be the submarine fleet that takes the war to the Japanese and keeps hammering home the fact that America's still in the war. But it's going to take direct action in stopping the Japanese. I mean, this slows their advance. There's not enough American submarines to stop all Japanese shipping, and Japanese task forces are well guarded by escort vessels, destroyers, and patrol boats that, were not able to get at a lot of capital ships and Japanese naval ships, but any commercial ships traveling, especially alone and unguarded, are in extreme peril as they make their journeys. And so you can see the extent by May of 1942, that orange line shows the areas under Japanese control and Japanese influence, the extent of Japanese power. As Japan was preparing to control all of the islands, especially New Guinea, and prepare for an assault on Port Moresby in an attempt to invade Australia, the setup for the invasion of Australia, it would be American efforts that stymie this. And it would be under the direction of the new American Commander-in-Chief, General-in-Chief, and Admiral-in-Chief in the Pacific, given the title of Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester Nimitz. Admiral Nimitz to show you how desperate things were when the Navy turned over command of a station, especially to a commander-in-chief. It would take place on the battleship. Well, this is just days after Pearl Harbor when Nimitz arrives in Hawaii to take command. There are no battleships that he can take over command. And so on the deck of a submarine, which is with a sense of realizing it is the submarines that are going to take the war to the enemy. Nimitz is going to be a very pro-submarine commander, but he takes over the Pacific Fleet aboard the USS Grayling, SS-209, in Pearl Harbor, and begins planning America's return to the South Pacific. In the grayest days, in late 1941, early 1942, it certainly has to be considered some of the grayest days of the war. It would be the U.S. Army Air Corps, in conjunction with the Navy, that strikes back the first really visible blow to the Japanese. Emperor Hirohito had bragged to the Japanese people, Prime Minister Tojo had bragged to the Japanese people that the Japanese home islands would be untouched. And so in early 1942, Colonel Jimmy Doolittle began training a group of 16 B-25 Mitchell bomber crews for an attack on Japan. Now, the B-25 Mitchell is a medium-range bomber, which means it has to operate from a base. It would have to be fairly close to Japan to be able to attack Japan. And there's absolutely no base that's going to survive those initial stages of the war. Even if the United States has still had the and we do in April 1942, still have the Philippines, these bombers don't have the range to reach from the Philippines to the Japanese home islands. So the wild, crazy plan that is concocted is to put these 16 bombers on one of the 3 aircraft carriers in the Pacific. The USS Hornet is going to carry the bombers, and you can see how tightly they had to pack. These bombers are too big to go in the deck underneath and be stored. Their wings don't fold up like a traditional carrier aircraft. They can't be made compact. So these are tied down on the fantail of the Hornet and lashed down for security. And these bomber crews train. They have no clue what they're training for. They train here in Texas. Their commanding officers, those couple that knew what they were training for, and it's an all-volunteer force, by the way. They mark off lines on the runway and say, here's your starting point, and you have to be airborne by this point. And it was an amazingly short distance. And in fact, as they train, I refer you to, a movie was made of this, but I refer you to the book instead. It's much better than the movie. Although the movie's not bad, the book is even better. It's called 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. And in that book, Commander Larson, who was one of the B-25 pilots, said they would practice on that runway in Texas. They would rev the engines, and they would redline the engines, and the engines are going full power, and the plane's about to shake apart, and the pilot and co-pilot are practically standing on the brakes to keep the plane from moving. And when the plane is at maximum rev, they let off on the brake and try to get airborne by the time they reach that line on the airfield. And they could do it. They could just do it. And so the idea is, with these bombers on board the aircraft carrier, it sails for Japan, and at some point off the coast of Japan, the planes will be launched, and each one of them carrying incendiary bombs. Tokyo, some of them carrying incendiary, the others carrying just iron bombs. The incendiary are designed to break apart as they're dropped from the plane, and they have a white phosphorus core that you can't put it out with water. And since Tokyo is made out of paper and wood for the most part, it was designed to catch Tokyo on fire. This will be a tactic, by the way, used throughout the war called firebombing. And it hopes that once you get the fire started, they can't contain it to do the maximum amount of damage. And so these planes are going to hit strategic targets and high-profile targets to embarrass the emperor, to embarrass Hirohito, and to embarrass Hirohito and Tojo, and then to strike a blow for the Allies. And so Doolittle's raid on Tokyo, April 18th, 1942, those 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers, and I'll refer you to these pictures as we discuss it. You can see how they took off. In the upper middle picture, you see the plane at full rev, and then as it proceeds down the deck, the landing signal officer is watching the rise and fall of the deck, and as the deck drops and goes up with the waves, this is a huge, some of these swells are 30, 40 feet. So as they go up and then down, he's got to time it. And he releases the plane when the ship is at its high point and headed down. He gives the plane the release, and it starts its taxi. And then as it hits the swell and goes up, the plane has to be going off the end of the aircraft carrier. Unfortunately for Doolittle's raiders, a Japanese trawler spotted the Hornet and its task force earlier than they anticipated. Now, these planes are loaded down not only with bombs, their gas tanks are as full as they can possibly get them. Then in any of the crew spaces, they're crammed with 55-gallon oil drums with aviation fuel inside the cabin. No smoking inside the airplane. They're crammed as tight as they can with aviation fuel, and the bombardier, who's not needed until they get over target, he's back there with the fuel pump, and as fuel is drained out of the aircraft's tanks, he's running a hand pump pumping from the 55-gallon drums into the fuel tanks, and then as soon as a tank is empty, they drop the oil drum out of the plane. Well, since they were discovered early, a lot of these planes don't have the range to reach their intended landing targets. Most of the planes were supposed to go to China and reach the Chinese forces. And so the American pilots wore jackets with what was known as the blood chit on them. It was a leather backing on their jackets that said in Chinese, it said, "I'm an American, I'm on your side, help me, provide any assistance you can." And so the planes were intended to land at Chinese airfields, but because of weather and because of fuel shortages, most of them didn't reach their intended landing fields. Of the 80 crewmen that participated in the raid, 5 of those crewmen, each plane had 5 men in it, a pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, and a gunner. So those five men, 5 of them become prisoners of war in the Soviet Union. I want to emphasize that because when we enter the Cold War, one of these little annoying things that had occurred throughout World War II is that American pilots who made it to our ally, the Soviet Union, that we are providing fuel, that we are providing planes, we are providing tanks, we're providing food, we're keeping them in the war, and they hold our pilots and our air crews as prisoners of war, not trusting that they truly are allies and holding them until the end of the conflict. So 5 of our bomber crews will be held in the Soviet Union until the end of the war. 62 would reach Chinese forces. 1 would be killed by a parachute drop. 4 would drown. 8 would be captured as prisoners of war in Japan. 3 of those 8 would be executed as war criminals. The others were incredibly harshly treated at their time. I mean, they had embarrassed the emperor. That's the lowest of the low. Many of those pilots that reached Chinese forces, like Larson writes in 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, as he was making, they were so low on fuel they couldn't find the airfield because of weather. they find a beach that they're going to land on, and as he's lining up to land on the beach, he has to fly over the water and then make a tight turn and land on the beach, crash land on the beach. Well, as he's making that turn, his landing gear catches a wave, and the plane just comes to a stop. It's like it hit a concrete wall. Larson, who was the pilot, Lawson as pilot, his face went through the windshield of the plane, and it mashed in his face. In fact, I remember he talks about in the book at one point, he said his teeth bothered him, so he reached in, and his entire upper palate pulled forward. When he put his fingers in his mouth and pulled on it, his entire upper face kind of popped out, that it had been mashed in by hitting the windshield. Just absolutely incredible what many of these pilots went through, either capture or torture. But Doolittle's raid, while doing moderate damage, I mean, it's not going to force Japan to end the war, but it sent a message. It sent a message that American forces could reach Tokyo. They could strike the home islands, and that America was in it to win it, to borrow a phrase. The first major stoppage of the Japanese offensive, though, will come at the Battle of Coral Sea. As Japan prepares to move on Australia, responsibility for the naval portion of the Pacific War is given to Admiral Nimitz, and you can see the dividing line here. And Nimitz kind of moving into an area that would be given to MacArthur, but the Northern Pacific, Central Pacific, and then the Southeastern Pacific were given to Nimitz's area of command. And then the Western Pacific, where the Philippines and most of Indonesia is located, was given to Douglas MacArthur to command. And so you're going to have a divided command structure, with the Navy ordered to support MacArthur, and MacArthur having control of most naval ships in his area. But the first major stoppage of that offensive will come at the Battle of Coral Sea. Nimitz risks 2 of his 3 aircraft carriers under the command of Admiral Frank Fletcher, called Task Force 17. The USS Lexington, the USS Yorktown, is going to meet Admiral Inouye and his 4th Fleet, which had 3 aircraft carriers, the small aircraft carrier Shoho, and then the Shokaku and the Zuikaku. Both of the larger fleet carriers had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor. So the American force is outnumbered, but the American carriers generally are larger than the Japanese carrier, and certainly larger than the Shoho. And in the ensuing Battle of the Coral Sea, the United States is going to lose one of its top carriers, the Lexington, which, when you consider that's 1/3 of the carriers in the Pacific, that's a huge loss. But at the same time, the Japanese are going to lose the Shoho and have both of their other aircraft carriers damaged. And so it stops the Japanese offensive, and they pull back rather than continuing on and staging for their attack on Australia. So you should know the Battle of Coral Sea, that it stops the Japanese offensive on Australia. Then the Japanese try to control the Central Pacific by seizing Midway Island. With a capture of Midway Island, the Japanese would then have extended their realm of influence thousands of miles eastward, but they would be within striking distance of Pearl Harbor. You can see I marked Midway with the arrow, and just to its east is the Hawaiian Islands. And so the Japanese send a carrier task force with 4 of their frontline carriers to attack Midway Island. The Yorktown, which had survived the Battle of Coral Sea, as I told you when we talked about the failures of the Japanese at Pearl Harbor, the Yorktown makes it back to Pearl Harbor, and in 72 hours is repaired sufficiently to put back to sea. Admiral Nimitz, because of coded intercepts, Unbeknownst to the Japanese, the U.S. code breakers had broken enough of the Japanese naval code to figure out where the Japanese were about to strike. Now, they couldn't read a lot of details. They could read about every fourth word. And so think of, the last text message you received. If you look at that text message and only read every fourth word, you're kind of shooting in the dark what your wife wants you to pick up at the supermarket or your husband wants you to do at Walmart. And so with the code breakers giving Nimitz an inkling of an idea, he puts Fletcher's task force out to sea, the Yorktown now accompanied by the Enterprise and the Hornet. So with the loss of the Lexington being replaced by the Hornet, and the Saratoga still being laid up in Washington. They had hoped to complete the Saratoga and race the Saratoga to the Battle of Midway, but it didn't arrive in time, and they had to use a lot of the pilots and planes from the Saratoga to supplement the losses that had been suffered by the Yorktown in the Battle of Coral Sea. So on June 3rd through the 7th, 1942, the turning point of the Pacific Theater comes. It's the Battle of Midway. In the lead elements, and this is where the Japanese make a huge mistake, they divide their force into multiple task forces. They divide their navy into 4 separate groups, with Admiral Yamamoto and the invasion force well behind Admiral Nagumo's carrier force. And the carrier force was to strike first, eliminate any opposition, and then Yamamoto would arrive with the invasion force and take Midway. And then a third group and fourth group were hitting the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. In the Battle of Midway, the American aircraft carriers, the Japanese have no clue where the American aircraft carriers are, whereas the Americans have a pretty good idea of how many Japanese carriers there are, where they're coming from, when they're coming, and a rough idea of where they could be found. And so it kind of narrows the scope of the American search, and both sides kind of find each other in the battle. It's kind of a meeting engagement, and in the ensuing conflict, the U.S. is going to lose the already damaged Yorktown. It's going to be sunk in the Battle of Midway, but they are going to in turn sink all 4 of the Japanese carriers. Now the United States, that brings the Japanese carrier force into parity with the American carrier force. Japan has the 2 surviving aircraft carriers from the Coral Sea. They've got other aircraft carriers at home. So with the aircraft carriers the U.S. currently has that survive Midway and what they can bring from the United States, they're roughly balanced now. But there's a huge difference. The United States has the resources to make more. Japan doesn't. And every day that passes, more and more ships are being turned out by American naval yards. And there's a picture I'll show you later of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, that it's American aircraft carriers about as far as the eye can see. That toward the end of the war, we outnumber the Japanese aircraft carriers by an overwhelming number. So now that the turning point has been reached, so with the success at Midway in June of 1942, and the turning point, the Navy and the Army began pushing Japan back in the Central and South Pacific. And so you see 2 axis corridors, if you will. You see the Navy that's going to push through the Central Pacific, and then the Navy and Army that are going to travel through the South Pacific, retaking New Guinea and then pushing toward the Philippines. The first major Allied assault will come in August of 1942. August of 1942 in the Allied amphibious assault at Guadalcanal. And in the attack on Guadalcanal, the goal is, and the reason Guadalcanal is absolutely necessary, is because of Henderson Field. The Japanese were building a major airstrip in which bombers could interdict all the supplies coming from the United States to Australia. In other words, it would isolate Australia and New Zealand and open up both areas for Japanese invasion. They still haven't given up that desire. And so what they are doing is building a major airfield. And under the defense of General Imamura, they are going to try to hold Guadalcanal for as long as possible. And so the 1st Marine Division hits the beaches. General Vandergrift's Marines hit the beaches of Guadalcanal and fight their way into the interior. This is a real slugfest. August 7, 1942. With both sides pumping naval ships in there to try to sway the battle one way or the other. And it would take until February, battle starts in August, it would take until February 1943 for Guadalcanal to fall completely to the United States. What then ensues, and the best way to explain American and Allied strategy in the Pacific, is called island hopping. That rather than retaking every island that the Japanese hold, you hit the major points, are points that will allow you to interdict supplies going to those major outposts, isolate them, and in the words of Admiral Nimitz, allow them to wither on the vine. And so Guadalcanal demonstrated how effective that could be done. This is American strategies given further impetus. The code breaking realized that over the island of Bougainvillea, Admiral Yamamoto was traveling for an inspection of the troops. And so American interceptors were sent up, and Admiral Yamamoto's plane was shot down. With the death of Admiral Yamamoto, it really demoralized the Japanese offensive capability. Not only are they losing the material capability, they lose their ideological zeal. Their great planner that was seen as the architect of victory is now dead. And they really never come up with a successful strategy to undo the island hopping campaign of the United States. In fact, after the war, Premier Tojo would say that this leapfrogging strategy that the U.S. employed was a major reason for the Allied victory. And it was successful because the United States very quickly gains air supremacy in the Pacific. And so from that beginning, the Allies will continue their offensive, and by no means are we going to look at every major battle. You need to know Guadalcanal as the first of the Pacific amphibious landings, and then for the drive toward the Central Pacific and the Japanese home islands, you need to know the invasion of Tarawa. And so the Tarawa campaign, November 20th, 1943, the Tarawa campaign begins the pushback in the Central Pacific. And once again, the absolute desperate defense, and that's what you see throughout, is the absolute desperate defense of the Japanese, holding these islands oftentimes to the last man. Other places you capture Japanese soldiers. In some places, you know, a guy that you think is a dead Japanese, you roll him over, and he may have been dead, but he died clutching a grenade. So as you roll him over, it explodes, killing the soldiers, inspecting to make sure he's dead. Just an desperate hand-to-hand fight. And you see this repeatedly throughout the Pacific as the Allies press toward the Philippines and the Japanese home islands. In the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese were forced to commit what remained of their naval forces. And in the battle for Leyte Gulf, the battleship Yamamoto and most of the Japanese vessels are simply destroyed. After Leyte Gulf, the Japanese Navy ceases to exist except for sparse ships here and there. But the Battle of Leyte Gulf allows General MacArthur to return to the Philippines and accomplish the American goal of restoring the Philippines. And in fact, with the capture of the Philippines back in the Spanish-American War, it had been the goal of the United States to make the Philippines an independent country. That was supposed to happen in 1942. Because of the invasion, it didn't happen until 1946. But MacArthur was assured the Filipinos that it would happen, and in fact it did. But also during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, a horrific side effect was observed: the increasing role of kamikaze attacks on the American fleet. And this is the picture I told you about earlier. You can see the American aircraft carriers led by the aircraft carrier Wasp. But these aren't just little jeep carriers, small carriers that just ferried planes. These are the massive fleet carriers. And here you can see 5 or 6 of them in a row. More might than the Japanese had at the height of their power, displayed in this one picture as they push toward the home islands. But Japan's forced to retaliate with kamikaze attacks. Pilots that load their planes with fuel and explosives, but only enough fuel for one way. They don't need to come home because they're going to crash their plane into American ships and try to inflict as many casualties in American ships and personnel as possible. So the increasing tempo of desperation is seen as the Americans get closer and closer to the Japanese home islands. Nothing more clearly revealed that than the assault on Iwo Jima. The assault on Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima is just a volcanic knob stuck in the middle of the Pacific. But it's close enough to the Japanese home islands that American bombers based on Iwo Jima would have fighter protection in hitting the home islands. Long gone are the need for the B-25s of Doolittle raid fame. These are the massive B-29 bombers, and even to a lesser extent the B-17 bomber. Now advance to the next slide just so you can see a B-29. B-29s that flew higher than most Japanese planes could reach. They have pressurized cabins, oxygen for the crews, fly extremely high. They are the state of the art at the time of aviation. And these planes had a massive range to reach the home islands, but they arrive unescorted. So Iwo Jima was seen as absolutely vital as a fighter base for escorting those bombers to and from the home islands. And so Iwo Jima is going to be assaulted by the Marines and the Army. And in the assault on Iwo Jima, it becomes absolutely clear that taking the home islands of Japan is going to be a long, bloody process. February 19th, 1945, the Marines assault the beaches at Iwo Jima. After 6 weeks, they finally root out the last of the Japanese survivors from the labyrinth of tunnels under this island. Being a volcanic island, there are lava tubes, which then by man-made excavation are expanded into concrete bunkers. The island was just networked with tunnels. And so it was necessary to push, and some of the most horrific fighting of the war, the use of mass use of flamethrowers and incendiary bombs. And you see the climax of the battle with the raising of the flag on Mount Suribachi, which has been immortalized by the World War II memorial in Washington, D.C. In the 6 weeks of fighting for this 5-mile square island, it cost 20,000 American casualties, 7,000 of those dead. Now, I've read the reports, and as President President Roosevelt has died, President Truman is receiving the casualty reports from Iwo Jima and then later Okinawa. And as he receives these reports, he also gets the intelligence. Vice President Truman didn't have the security clearance as vice president to be informed about the technological marvel being invented in Tennessee called the Manhattan Project. The atomic bomb, as you know it, was being developed and then tested in the deserts of New Mexico. They perfect the bomb and successfully test a bomb and inform the president that this is now an option. And as he sees the casualty figures from Iwo Jima, as he sees the casualty figures from Okinawa, he's looking at the Japanese home islands, and his advisors are telling him it will cost 1 million American casualties. 1 million American casualties. For Harry Truman, the decision was easy to make. In his own words, it was easy to make. So why is the United States the only power to ever use a nuclear weapon against a hostile force? Because it saved American lives. And Harry Truman made that decision based on that fact alone. And quite frankly, the atomic bombs, while they are horrific in nature and they did inflict incredible casualties, far more devastating were the firebombings of Tokyo. And you can see the two great firebombing raids, March 10th and May 23rd, 1945. Each one of these raids killed up to 100,000 Japanese civilians. Even the most liberal estimate of the death toll from the atomic bombs puts it at 50,000 people. More people died in the firebombing of Tokyo than died in the atomic blast at Hiroshima. Because what happens in Tokyo as the firebombing, and it's not just the simple B-25s this time, it's the massive B-29s. These bombs set off what was known as a firestorm. A fire that was so hot and so large that it created its own weather. It fed itself. Just absolutely destructive, and seeing some of the pictures. And I've tried not to, in talking about the war, bring the absolute brutality out. A mother and child burned to death and just charred corpses on the ground. You don't need to see that. You know the horrors of war. You see it every day on the TV. And this is war on a massive scale. So when Harry Truman hears about the casualty figures from Iwo Jima and Okinawa, even though the firebombing is successful, Japan is given an opportunity to surrender. Now, we're going to talk about this in the next module because it's part of the Cold War. But as the war is winding down, in in the summer of 1945, the big three meet for the last time, and in fact, by the time of this meeting at Potsdam, Germany, Franklin Roosevelt's dead, so the new president, Harry Truman, is representing the United States, Joe Stalin representing the Soviet Union, and starting the conference will be Winston Churchill, but he will be replaced by a new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, right as the conference begins. These three leaders reach an agreement that Japan must unconditionally surrender, that the emperor had to step down. And they issue a warning known as the Potsdam Declaration that Japan only had a short amount of time and gave them a very specific deadline, early August of 1945, to surrender. If they didn't, they would face catastrophic destruction. If the Japanese knew about the atomic bomb, they didn't believe the United States had another one. And so on August the 6th, 1945, the United States will drop the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and then 3 days later follow it up with the atomic bombing of Nagasaki. The Japanese then ask for an armistice as they fight within their own government. One element wanting to continue the war until they're all killed, another element wanting to ask for surrender terms. And so as the bitter fight within Japan takes place, and it takes time for the officials and the negotiating of a treaty, the official Japanese surrender comes on September 2nd, 1945, known as VJ Day. So September 2nd, 1945, VJ Day, World War II officially comes to an end. And yet here in the victory are the seeds of the next war, not only because of what we've already talked about in the previous video of the Japanese occupation of Korea and French Indochina and the putting in of Soviet and American surrogates that then lead to fighting in the Cold War, but even right here at the end, at the negotiation of Potsdam, the Soviet Union pledged itself to enter the war within 60 days of the Potsdam Conference. Follow the timeline. August the 6th, Hiroshima is attacked. The Soviets, through spies, know that the next attack is planned for August the 9th. The Soviet Union declares war on Japan August the 8th. Nagasaki's bombed on August the 9th, and then the armistice is requested and granted, and so the Soviets declare war but then don't do anything. And that sows the seeds of future hatreds. And so out of the victory of World War II will come the taste like ashes effect of the Cold War, which we will talk about in the next module of the next video. All right.